Tensions continue to rise in the Korean Peninsula with fears of more tests from North Korea. Leaders of the U.S. and China have discussed in North Korea with minor headway on the crisis. In this edition of the debate, we'll discuss how serious the North is in conducting another missile test, how close the U.S. and North Korea are to a war breaking out, or will U.S. President Trump and the Chinese president reach an agreement on the matter?
Tensions continue to rise on the Korean Peninsula as the threat of a military confrontation between the U.S. and North Korea seems to be at its highest. During a phone conversation with his U.S. counterpart, Chinese President Xi Jinping called for a peaceful resolution of the situation and stressed that Beijing is committed to the denuclearization of the peninsula. The communication between the leaders underscores the increasing sense of urgency as the situation escalates amid concerns that North Korea could soon conduct a sixth nuclear test or more missile launches.
We are sending an armada, very powerful. We have submarines, very powerful, far more powerful than the aircraft carrier, that I can tell you. And we have the best military people on earth.
The comments of U.S. President Donald Trump come after he ordered the deployment of the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson strike group to the Korean Peninsula. Trump had already warned of taking a unilateral action against Pyongyang and said the U.S. would solve the problem with or without China's help. The move has caused uproar in North Korea, with Pyongyang warning that it is ready for war and would nuke down American military bases at any sign of aggression. This is how North Koreans have reacted to the move.
The U.S. is trying to isolate us, but the Korean people will stay united around our supreme leader and the party, and we will defend our national sovereignty. We will smash all the maneuvers of the U.S., and then we will achieve the final victory.
The ongoing joint U.S.-South Korea military drills that began last month have also added fuel to the fire. Pyongyang sees the drills as a rehearsal for invasion. Washington is also going ahead with the deployment of its advanced missile system known as THAAD to South Korea, despite opposition from many inside South Korea in addition to Russia and China. Despite the ongoing tensions on the Korean Peninsula, leading candidates in the May 9th presidential election in South Korea have pledged to hold dialogue with Pyongyang, which they argue is the real solution to the crisis rather than threats and war. Trump has followed a hardline policy regarding North Korea since he took office on January the 20th. He came to power promising a foreign policy doctrine based on putting America first and avoiding messy conflicts in distant land. However, Trump's most recent decisions seem to signal that he's ready to follow the traditional U.S. policy of military interventions as an ultimate solution to issues around the world.
Is let Obamacare explode?
Well, I guess joining us for this edition of the debate, Jason Unruhe, he's a political commentator and analyst, joins us from Toronto. And we also have Michael Lane, founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, who joins us from Washington. I'd like to welcome both of you. So we're looking at a tense situation, and I'll start, Michael Lane, with you. At this point, the U.S. carrier group is steaming towards the Korean Peninsula. You have North Korea saying that it's ready for war. You have the Japanese, the Japanese Navy is planning exercises with the U.S., and this is one of many that has happened. And an influential state-run Chinese newspaper warning that the Korean Peninsula was the closest it has been to a military clash since North Korea's first nuclear test back in 2006. This all sounds like there's going to be war, or is there not going to be one? Do we have Michael Lane?
At this point, whether or not there will be war, but the circumstances are such that essentially nothing has changed. North Korea has been threatening to use its military capabilities for a decade or more. The United States has been conducting a show of force with their naval assets in the Yellow Sea and in and around the Korean Peninsula for decades. Japan has been a cooperative ally of the United States for 60, 70 years. So essentially nothing has changed, although the rhetoric and the ratcheting up of the tensions seems to be there. There is still time for a peaceful solution to this emerging crisis. The solution, I think all parties agree, is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The only question that remains outstanding is exactly how that denuclearization takes place. China, of course, President Xi had a good phone conversation with President Trump just a couple hours ago. Both sides indicate that they are committed to a peaceful resolution of the crisis. But this is really up to North Korea as to how this gets resolved. Because if they continue to take provocative and belligerent steps in terms of testing nuclear capabilities and testing intercontinental ballistic missiles, this crosses a line that the rest of the world can't accept.
Well, maybe we should lay out, Jason Unruhe, whether this has reached now at the most that it can in terms of the repeated tests by North Korea. Because at this point, North Korea has warned that it could soon conduct a sixth missile test. Do you think that, first of all, the chances of that, and is that going to be what's going to trigger some kind of military action, and what would that look like?
Well, I think it's very likely that the DPRK will carry out another nuclear test. That is their one assurance against invasion by the United States. The point of developing the nuclear technology has always been to provide a great deterrent, that if the DPRK were to be invaded, they know militarily they cannot win, but they will make the price of invading them so high that it will not be worth the effort. And as they continue to build greater U.S. and Japanese forces inside the region, aiming the guns of imperialism at the country, the DPRK is only incentivized to create even more nuclear weapons, even more powerful weapons. But standing up against the greatest power, the military and economic power in the world, is no small feat, and it's certainly necessary. The real question is, since the DPRK has always maintained their right to self-defense and their right to self-determination, and have not stepped outside of their own borders to do so, we have to ask whether or not the United States is really willing to engage in a nuclear war just to try to eliminate a government that doesn't carry out their particular interests. The DPRK has only threatened to retaliate if anything is thrown against them, if a military invasion is carried out. The first strike would have to come from the United States, because the DPRK has been pursuing a path of independence, not conquest, as the United States has.
Do you agree with that the first strike has to come from the U.S., Michael Lane? There's a report by this newspaper that says China has a bottom line that it will protect at all costs the security and stability of the Northeast China, and that the Chinese People's Liberation Army will launch attacks to DPRK facilities on its own. This source being the Global Times, and of course that's owned and operated by the Communist Party's People's Daily newspaper. But the U.S. first, or what this periodical has said, China?
Well, that's of course the $64 million question. The Global Times, as I understand it, although it's owned by the Chinese Communist Party, it doesn't always speak for the party, and therefore cannot be read per se as a prediction as to what Chinese policy is going to be at the highest levels. Nonetheless, the fact that they raise it and discuss it is a very interesting phenomenon given the environment that we're in now. I think that there is, the question is first strike of conventional materials, and then the second thing is first strike of nuclear materials. I doubt very much that anyone would use a first strike of nuclear weapons against the government of North Korea. That's not necessary, one wouldn't think, to accomplish the mission of taking out the the existing regime and having it replaced with something a little bit more stable, a little bit less belligerent. But as Jason mentioned, the retaliatory capabilities of North Korea are such that they could make a not comprehensive first strike a very huge price to pay, as if they got one or two nuclear devices up in the air and flying towards their targets. It would be an absolute disaster. So I think that really what we're looking at is some sort of clandestine activity, ultimately as a weapon of first choice, where there would not be an all-out conflict between Korea and its adversaries, but really something along the lines of a surgical strike that would give the cooler heads in North Korea a chance to take control of the government, de-escalate, and work with the civilized world from there. Look, the real problem we're facing, I've been dancing around it, the real problem we're facing is the world considers Kim Jong-un to be extraordinarily unstable and irrational. And so conventional and rational measures to persuade him to take certain courses of action are perceived not to be effective. No one knows how he'll react. And when you're dealing with somebody who is irrational or perceived to be irrational, you know, you're playing blind and you're coming up with new solutions all the time. But I do think a surgical strike is the likely answer as a first try.
Well, Jason Unruhe, let's look at Trump, even though he may not be as reliable as the newspaper that's owned by China in some respects in terms of the views he has expressed. But he has said that Xi can do more. Of course, they had a phone conversation just hours ago that said it was a positive one, but he has said we're going to go and solve this problem with or without China's help. So the question is China able to solve this problem or not?
I would say that China can wield influence in this problem, but essentially this really does come down to what the DPRK decides to do, or what the United States decides to do. Both South Korea and China can wield as much influence as they want, but the real deciding factor is Kim Jong-un going to dismantle the nuclear program in order to hand over the control of the government to U.S. imperialist interests? Or is the United States going to attack them? China wants what South Korea would partially want as well, and that's a relative political stability in order to carry out trade between the two countries. It's far more profitable for the DPRK to be in a state of peace in order for China to carry out trade with them. When tensions are high like this, there tends to be a lot of shutting down of the special economic zones and other trade like that, and it's not good for the Shanghai Stock Exchange, etc. But China can ask the DPRK for whatever it is that they want, as much as they want. But this really comes down to the stubborn independence of the DPRK to determine their own destiny. And I sincerely doubt that China wields that much influence over them, and they have to make that determination for themselves.
Michael Lane, maybe it's a good time that I ask a very simple question, one that hasn't been asked in this program, and that is, what is China's reasons for supporting North Korea?
Well, North Korea has been a client state of China for a long time. Everybody wants to expand their spheres of influence. North Korea was the odd guy out. China had the chance to do it, and their relationship has built. It creates an opportunity for North Korea to be a thorn in the side of the United States and other countries around, Japan, etc. So in general, as long as North Korea behaves as a rational thorn in the side of China's adversaries, then it was good. But when North Korea crosses over into the completely unpredictable and uncontrollable and irrational behavior zone that it appears to be in now, even China needs to worry. Now, if I can answer a little bit of the question you just asked, Jason, you know, they have, I don't think China can control completely North Korea. They've sort of created a monster that goes beyond their ability to steer it at this point. But the three things they have are coal, oil, and the banks. And they can refuse imports and exports with North Korea, bringing the regime even closer to economic collapse. And they can take away Korea's access to the international banking system by not allowing it to use Chinese banks as correspondent banks and thus access the world. Those are the three things they can do: trade and, or two things: trade and energy, and the Chinese banking system. If they did that, they would certainly have North Korea's attention. Whether or not Kim Jong-un at that point would begin to behave more rationally than he has in the past is unpredictable.
Well, Jason, Unruhe, one thing that I'm looking at that, again, it's somewhat talking about the military aspect of this debate, and that is the fact that the commander of the U.S. forces in South Korea did not come to Washington for congressional hearings this month. And that is said that obviously there's the hazardous situation that exists in the peninsula. And some say that's a sign that there will be a military confrontation of one kind or another. But then there's the other side of the coin that says if there was going to be one, with all the U.S. Personnel that's stationed in South Korea, that the U.S. would have definitely sent out a warning. Again, I'm sorry to come in again from the military aspect of this, but we're trying to figure out whether there's going to be a military showdown happening or not. Do you think those two, with those two pieces of fact, what is your analysis, again, on the military confrontation theme here?
Well, I don't think that it's tremendously a big deal that he didn't show up for the meeting. In the end, he really does answer to the president. He answers to his higher-ups, his superior officers. I'm certain that if he had been there, he could give more relevant, detailed information. But in the end, he answers to someone higher up. So I don't think it's all terribly that significant or even really says much of anything. For all we know, the guy could be really busy and just didn't have time to be able to attend a hearing like that. So I don't really think it's relevant within the way you described it.
The weight that Trump has given the deals with Xi Jinping, Michael Lane, obviously could be a lot. He has accused China on a whole variety of economic issues, but he has said that China will get a much better trade deal with the United States if Beijing helps disarm North Korea. I mean, what type of concessions can we be talking about in order for China to be able to wield that kind of influence on North Korea? What would China get in return?
Well, the two big economic issues that President Trump has with China are, number one, the allegations of currency manipulation, and number two, the tremendous trade deficit that the United States runs with China. And I believe that you know, the first becomes really problematic. If you press a claim for currency manipulation, it takes on a life of its own, and it starts to grow, and international organizations get involved in it, and it really is a huge Donnybrook. If President Trump were to assure the Chinese that he would take, for the time being, that tool off the table and not press currency manipulation charges against China, while at the same time saying, okay, we're running this big a trade deficit with you, we want to get it down to this big, but we're willing to live with this big if you help us really, really resolve the North Korean problem. Those are two things I think that would be very attractive to China. Certainly the United States is a huge market for them. They would like to maintain it. And you know, it becomes a matter of their decision. Do they think that that they will be able to have a better relationship with the United States if the Korean issue is resolved? And what will they have to give up to resolve that Korean situation? I think President Trump hopes that they will see it his way and help to resolve it, and he's probably willing to be flexible in his negotiations if they are.
Okay, we're going to end it there. Unfortunately, we just don't have the time. Thank you very much, Michael Lane, founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, talking to us there from Washington and from Toronto. Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst. Thank you for your comments. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From the Cover Taiwan entire team in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.